are in listen-only mode.
Hello everyone and welcome. Thanks for joining us today for a conversation with Richard Barrett about his latest book, The Values-Driven Organization, Unleashing Human Potential for Performance and Profit. My name is Hannah Lee and I work at Barrett Value Center with Richard. During this presentation we are going to keep you on mute. That's just so we can have a nice comfortable presentation today without too much background noise. But if at any time you have a question for Richard, please type that into your chat box and I will get that for you and give it to Richard, and then we will get through as many questions as possible. So again, anytime during this presentation if you have a question, please type that into your chat box. So now I'm going to hand it over to Richard. He's going to give us a little bit of background about his latest book, and we'll go from there. Thanks again. Hi Richard, how are you doing today?
Oh, great. Yes, thank you. Yes, a bit shocked with the British weather, which has suddenly gone cool and rainy, having had such a wonderful time lately, but getting used to that. And hoping everybody listening in is sitting comfortably. So I'm going to talk about the values-driven organization, and what I want to start off with is a link so that if you want to download a larger version of this presentation, you can do that. In order to keep things relatively within the time period and leave room for questions, I've hidden a number of slides, but you can get the full presentation at slideshare.net, Barrett Values, and you can just look up the values-driven organization. You don't need to have that whole list of words there, but just go to slideshare.net/Barrett Value.
That link is also in the chat box if anyone wants to just click on that link.
Oh, thanks, Anna. That's brilliant. Yeah, why didn't I think of that? Thanks for being there. Yep. And also, I wanted to say that here on the screen now you see a few words by Raj Sisodia, who wrote the book of Firms of Endearment, and together with John Mackey, the book on conscious capitalism, he said these very kind words about my book, and I'm very pleased for that. Also, just want to let you know you can get a 20% discount on the book. Just drop Hannah a line email, hannah@valuecenter.com, and she'll send you a certificate with a 20% discount, which you can cash in with the publisher. The discount comes in US dollars or in British pounds, so you need to specify which you want. If you're trying to buy the book in euros, I think what you have to do is contact with one of these certificates and then give them your card number, and that should work okay. So that's the new book. It came out 3 weeks ago. I'm excited about it as always. I've been on a roll recently. This is my fourth book in 4 years, and I've got another one on the go right now. Can't resist telling you the title, Evolutionary Coaching, and a new approach to personal coaching. That won't be out until middle of next year, but enjoying myself working on that right now. But let's get back to the values-driven organization. And one of the big questions that I wanted to answer in this book is, why are values-driven organizations the most successful on the planet? What do they focus on, and what makes them so successful? Well, the simple answer is they care about the needs of their people. That's what makes organizations successful. Where can we find such organizations? Well, the list of best companies to work for is a great starting point. Now, what's the link there? It's pretty obvious. A best company to work for is a company that looks after its employees' needs. So I plotted from the USA the top 40 best companies to work for. I plotted their portfolio value over a period of 10 years. I got some an advisor at Wells Fargo to do that for me, and what we saw in the red line is the best companies to work for. That's the BCWF. The average annualized return was 16.39%, which is massive, really, compared to the S&P 500. That's the standard American index of only 4.12% over this 10-year period. So if you're getting 16% every year on your investment, I mean, that's huge. In these days, it's absolutely remarkable. And so why do the best companies to work for engender high levels of employee engagement and commitment? Because they focus on the employees' needs, their basic needs and their growth needs. We'll talk more about basic needs and growth needs in a moment. I also looked at the 18 firms of endearment that Raj Sisodia wrote about and plotted their results. And the results are very similar to the best companies to work for. Many of the firms of endearment, at least a third or a half, are actually privately held companies, so I wasn't able to get their data so readily. I couldn't get it at all, but I did get the publicly traded companies, and you see it's a rate of return which is relatively similar to the best companies to work for. Now, if you may recall from the firms of endearment that what these companies do, they respond to all stakeholders' needs. They take care to make sure that they treat all their stakeholders as equally as possible. I heard from Raj the other day that he's planning an update to firms of endearment, Volume 2, and he's working on that right now. So that was his original book, and then came the book on conscious capitalism with John Mackey, who is the CEO of Whole Foods Market. Now, I then took a look at the Jim Collins Good to Great companies. Remember, he wrote the book with another researcher called Built to Last, and then he went on to write the book Good to Great. And these companies didn't do so well. They had an average annualized return of 5.32% over the same period compared to the S&P 500 of 4.12. Hardly any difference. In fact, of the 8 or 9 companies listed in Good to Great, and you'll see this in the full slide deck, I took that list of companies out, so just to save time, in fact, one of these companies went bankrupt, another had to be bailed out by the U.S. government, that was Wells Fargo, etc., etc. And the conclusion that I come to in the book is that really these so-called good to great companies on their own, the characteristics that Collins identified on their own are not sufficient for long-term success, because they really focus on strategies rather than on culture. And I think that's the big difference. I'm not invalidating Jim Collins' work. I'm only saying that it didn't focus on culture, it didn't focus on employees' needs, it was much more focused on strategies. And the strategies sometimes work and sometimes they don't, as we can see from these results. So, as I've said, the difference between the best companies to work for and other companies is that they care about the needs of their employees. And what does that mean? It means they care about what their employees value. So what is it that employees value? Well, what people value is really the key to creating a high-performing organization. So when you support employees in satisfying their needs and helping them to get what they value, you get high levels of employee engagement. And when that happens, of course, they respond by bringing their commitment and creativity to their work and unleash their discretionary energy. That's the amount of energy that they would otherwise take home and put into sporting activities, etc., etc. They find so much meaning in their work, they're willing to go the extra mile and put in the extra effort to make sure that the company does well. So if you want to build a high-performing culture, then you need to care about what your employees value. Now, what motivates people, there's a lot written about motivation, but actually what motivates people are the values, or the values that they have, but the values they have are a reflection of the needs of the stage of psychological development that they've reached. So depending on where you are in the different stages of your psychological development, you will value different things. Our needs, that is what we value, have always been and always will be the principal drivers of our behaviors and actions. So what are our basic needs and growth needs? And well, many of you have seen this before. This is the 7 levels model based on Maslow, satisfying your physiological needs. That's the first of the basic needs. You need to feel safe and secure. You need to satisfy your emotional need for belonging and protection and connection, and then satisfying your emotional need to be recognized for your skills, talents. In other words, these are our basic needs. And we feel anxious if these needs are not met, but once we've satisfied these needs, we don't pay much more attention to them. We move on to satisfying our growth needs, our need for autonomy, freedom, and independence, our need to find authenticity by getting meaning and purpose in our lives, finding out what we're passionate about and devoting our time to that, satisfying the need to actualize your work in the world by making a difference, and lastly, by leaving a legacy. And in some ways, well, in many ways actually, these needs and these stages of levels of consciousness are actually stages of psychological development that we all pass through. And up to the time we become young adults, we're basically focused on satisfying our basic needs in the culture that we were brought up in. And for some people, that's pretty much where they stay for the rest of their lives. And for other people, they move on, they get educated, and they begin to realize that the values that they hold are maybe somewhat different, the beliefs they hold may be somewhat different from the beliefs and values of the culture they were brought up in, and they begin their search for autonomy and freedom. And once they've started that journey, level 4, they find that what is inhibiting them are some of the fears that they're holding on to, which they learned early in their lives. And we have to focus on personal mastery. That's the first stage of level 4. And the second stage of level 4 is getting in touch with the deeper sense of meaning that we have about our life purpose. You could say that's the soul purpose. And the growth needs that are all then about unfolding the purpose of the soul in the world. The book I wrote just before this last one on the values-driven organization is What My Soul Told Me, and it's a practical guide to soul activation. In other words, a practical guide to moving from the beginning of level 4 all the way up to level 7. So, at any moment in time, our values are a reflection of our unmet basic needs and the growth needs associated with the stage of psychological development we've reached. Now, I want to introduce you to this work. Some of you may be familiar with it. Robert Keegan and Lisa Lahi identified 3 plateaus of psychological development. The socialized mind, the self-authoring mind, and the self-transforming mind. It's in the first part of this book called Immunity to Change. And basically, it maps to the 7 levels of consciousness. So the socialized mind is focused on meeting its survival, relationship, and self-esteem needs. And people operating with this type of mind think of their work as a job, a way of earning a living. They may enjoy their work and colleagues, but are not passionate about what they do. It's a way of living comfortably. If they can get the right job, if they can get more pay, they'll go elsewhere. The self-authoring mind is the mind that begins to open up at the level 4 consciousness, where we focus on achievement and ambition. We want more for ourselves, than the people who live with the socialized mind. The people with the socialized mind tend not to want too much responsibility. They enjoy their life. They don't enjoy it so much if they have to struggle, but if they've got a good job and a reasonable income, they're happy. Whereas the self-authoring mind is much more focused on achievement and will be hoping to find work which will give them opportunities to grow in their career. So they're looking at their work now as a career rather than a job, a pathway to a better future. And then we move on to the self-transforming mind, which is a higher level of mind, see their work as a mission in life. They want to leave a legacy and be of service to the world. And once again, these stages tend to be follow you as you grow older. I can quite remember operating at a self-authoring mind level way back in early 1970s when I was sent to Paris to open an office for an engineering company, and I mean I was all drive and ambition at that stage. That stuck with me for some time, but in more recent years I'm more just focused on making a difference in the world and actually not so much leaving a legacy, but being of service to the world. There are some other characteristics of these different types of mind, because each stage of development, you can say each stage of the 7 levels of consciousness, as you move to the higher stage, you're able to deal with more complexity in the world. Your mind becomes more complex, but you're able to deal with the complexity in the world. In this sense, it's an evolutionary progression. So we evolve by being able to handle more complexity in the world and understanding the world in a way that allows us to actually intervene and make a difference. Now, the social mind is a dependent mind. It's really dependent on other people that is in its social context to give feedback, and so the socialized mind wants to fit in, basically. It wants to be in alignment with other people, and it has a limited ability for independent thinking, whereas a self-authoring mind has a clear worldview and places priority on receiving information that fits with its worldview. It's actually not so much interested in other worldviews as getting information to support its own worldview. And that's fine and good to a point, but then there are other people out there. We all live in a context, we live in a social context, and other people have worldviews which may be different to ours, and that's where the self-transforming or interdependent mind comes in, because the interdependent mind can stand back and look at itself and say, aha, yeah, that's a really interesting idea. I can adapt my own worldview to incorporate this other aspects of these other worldviews. And so it's an adaptive mind that is willing, that doesn't see the world, it sees the world through its filters of worldview, but is willing to adapt that worldview and take in other people's worldview. That's not so true at the self-authoring mind level.
Richard, we have a couple of questions that kind of get into these models. If you don't mind, I might ask a couple as you're sort of in there.
Go ahead, that's brilliant.
Okay. The first one says, it seems that in real life we develop in a fashion that is much more chaotic than the diagram of Maslow's hierarchy would suggest. What is the quickest, most stable path of development? Is it desirable to master one stage before moving on to developing the next? And can we skip stages?
Okay, let me just check one thing. Might have a slide coming up here that could answer this question. No, I took that out. Well, basically, what I have done is I've related the 7 levels of psychological development, the 7 levels of consciousness modeling, and basically the 7 levels of psychological development occur usually always in the same pattern, And they're these. So you'll recognize them as the 7 levels of consciousness, but they're actually stages of psychological development. The first is surviving. When, as the baby is born, all its instincts come into play to find ways of surviving, and it knows how to suckle, it knows quickly how to smile to get attention so that it's protected. So instinctively, we move into that survival mode during the first year or two of our life. And then we move into the next mode, which is the conforming level of psychological development, which we realize that we're embedded in a parental structure, and that in order to get our needs met, we need to fit in. And so this next stage of psychological development is about conforming, and from the levels of consciousness point of view, we would call that relationship consciousness. And then as we get to 9, 10, 11, we begin to be out in the world, more outside of our parental home, in schools, etc. And we begin to want to excel and differentiate ourselves. So the next stage is differentiation, and we do that by excelling at whatever we can do and feeling a sense of self-worth. You can begin to see how each of these stages of psychological development relates to the 7 levels of consciousness. So now, these 3 stages of psychological development are relatively fixed for everybody. I've not seen any literature that says these stages, you skip one stage to go to the next. No, they're a pattern that we go through up to our teenage years. And we come pretty much out of that process with some views of some worldviews and some beliefs about how the world works, and by this time we're in our early 20s. And some people will get a good education and others won't, and the ones who get a good education will begin to question the beliefs and the values that they grew up with. And so after differentiation, we've had surviving, we've had conforming, we've had differentiating, and we move to the next stage, which is individuation, a stage which Carl Jung talked about quite a lot, whereby we begin to let go of the cultural conditioning that surrounded us, that we were brought up and that formed our worldviews, and begin to explore who we really are, the individuation stage. As we explore who we really are, we move then into the self-actualization stage that Maslow talked about, where we begin to get a sense of our own inner, deeper meaning to life, and we begin to search for ways in which our life can have meaning by doing the work that is important to us, and that's the self-actualization stage. And as we move through that stage, it doesn't seem much point in just being self-actualized unless we actually make a difference, which in the psychological terms is called the integration stage, where we integrate fully who we are into what we do, and then move to the serving stage. So these stages of psychological development are pretty much etched in stone. Now, having said all of that, that's a pathway that we're all on, but at any stage we can let's say we've reached level 4 or level 5, and we lose our job, and we lose all our money. We will shift very quickly to the survival level of consciousness. So we may be at stage 4 psychological development, but then in terms of consciousness, our consciousness is focused on what is most important to us at a particular moment in time. I hope that answers the question. I could go on a bit more, but it's all laid out in the book too, and I hope that at least gets some way to answering the question for the moment. Any more questions, Hannah?
Yeah, there's actually, building on that question, is talking about these models in international and developing countries. And the questions are, do we have to develop sequentially, or is there a place for supporting the higher stages of individuals' development in a context where basic needs aren't met? It seems that meeting higher but not perceived needs could have the effect of uplifting, accelerating a person's development. What is your experience?
Yeah, now I'm writing about this in my new book, Evolutionary Coaching. In fact, I was just writing a piece on this morning, and basically what I'm saying is this, that we live in a context. I mean, the human beings live in a social context, a family context, a societal context, a tribal context, whatever. And we may be, for various reasons, able to meet our basic needs and want to move to a higher stage of psychological development, but we can't do that if the context in which we're living, either the organization or the nation or the community, hasn't reached that level of consciousness, and so, or that level of psychological development. And so it's okay, we can follow our normal psychological development path if we live, for example, in a liberal democracy. That's like the best ever for us to be able to explore our full potential and growth in terms of psychological development. But if we're living in Russia, if we were living in the USSR 20, 30 years ago, or even in China today, moving to the individuation stage and moving to the self-actualization stage, where you became a threat to the governing authorities, then you were locked up, and they didn't like intellectuals, they didn't like self-actualizing individuals. Even today in Russia, if you question, Putin and the authorities there, you are not safe. And the people who are questioning are these people who are reaching these individuation stages and self-actualization stages. So absolutely, your level of psychological development, if you're living in a cultural context that is at a lower level than you are, you're going to feel blocked. The same applies in organizations, and when we map the values of organizations, we see that. We see organizations that are stuck at levels 1, 2, and 3 of consciousness with a lot of limiting values, and when you look at the desired culture, all of the values are showing up at that transformation level, that individuation level, and people are saying, we need to transform this, because if we don't transform it, they're either going to leave. Well, they will probably leave unless they're operating with a socialized mind and they can't find alternative employment with more money, then they'll stay. But the people who are operating with that self-authoring mind will look, and self-transforming mind in that situation will look around for other jobs. I hope that gives some clues as to, or provides some answer to that question. Anybody there? Anna?
I'm here.
Okay. Well, I hope there's somebody else. Oh, yeah, we've got other people out there. Good. Look, I'm happy to take more questions, but I realize the hour is halfway up, and I'm less than 1/3 of the way through my presentation here. But I'm quite willing to just go on a bit longer and answer any more questions at this point, if there are any.
There is one more question, and it goes back to the beginning of your presentation about values-driven organizations and how they're the best in the world. And the question really is, would you say that this means that employees are the primary stakeholders to focus on in a multi-stakeholder approach?
Totally. Absolutely. Unquestionably. I think that's an unequivocal answer.
Well, there you have it.
That's where it is. If you can capture the commitment of an employee by meeting their needs at the level of psychological development they're at, then they will happily work for you. In the socialized mind level, that will mean having benefits and rewards and salaries which are adequate, and also getting some sort of positive feedback about the work that they're doing. At the self-authoring mind level, that will be giving people opportunities and challenges to do exciting things. And at the self-transforming level, it will be giving people tasks and roles that provide meaning and align with their sole purpose so they can actually make a difference in the world. So if you can do all of those things, and that's exactly what I'm just about to talk about, you'll be able to, you'll have a high-performing organization. So what is it that the motivating mind, socialized mind, what motivates the socialized mind? Well, here we have it in front of us. A safe environment and income and benefits that are sufficient to take care of our needs and families, a caring environment at the relationship level, and opportunity to learn and grow at the self-esteem level. And then at the level 4 and 5, we've got opportunity to use gifts and talents by being made accountable for challenging projects at level 5. Opportunity to lead a values and purpose-driven life that is meaningful to you and supports the organization. And then at the self-transforming mind level, opportunities to leverage our impact in the world by collaborating with other people and forming alliances. And finally, opportunities to leave a legacy or to be of service to the world in future generations. So if you can provide all of these different things for employees, you're actually giving people what they value based on the needs of the level of psychological development they're at. So what are the 4 conditions for employee engagement? Well, we know what are our highly engaged employees. They identify with the company, they care passionately about the company, they bring their passion and purpose to work, they're willing to invest their discretionary energy, and they want the company to do the right thing. In other words, they want to be ethically sound, they want to be trusted, because their identity is wrapped up in the company. So they want to feel pride in the way that the company behaves. So I defined 4 levels of employee engagement: highly engaged, bringing your passion and purpose to your work; engaged, willing to go the extra mile in helping the company achieving its goals and objectives; disengaged, employees do what they have to do to get through the day but are willing to put in any extra effort; and highly disengaged, employees who are unhappy at their work and act out their unhappiness by actively undermining the company. And in one of the slides that are hidden, I try to relate these levels of engagement to the different types of mind and show where you have high cultural risk and low cultural risk. But I won't go into that right now. Let me just go into the 4 conditions for employee engagement. First of all, the personal alignment. Okay, well, let me just go back. This is Ken Wilber's model which describes a social system. You've got the interior of the individual. That's the values and beliefs of the individual, the character. You've got the exterior of the individual. That's the personality, what shows up through behaviors. You've got the interior of the collective. That's the culture. And you've got the exterior of the collective. That's the behaviors of the society, the rules, the laws, etc. This can apply to an organization or a nation. And so in order to get employee engagement, the leaders of the organization have to be in personal alignment. They have to walk their talk. They have to operate with integrity. So who they say they are, their values, align with their behaviors at a high level. And you also need structural alignment. And structural alignment is the same thing, only at the organizational level, so that if the company says that it embraces teamwork, but rewards individuals for their effort, then it's out of alignment. And so what you have to do in structural alignment is you have to align the values of the organization with its behaviors as seen in all the systems and processes. And I devote a whole chapter to structural alignment in the new book. And then We've got values alignment, that is the values of the organization are in alignment with the individual's values, and we can say that we feel that the organization is on the right track, that the employees feel that the organization is doing a good job and they can feel aligned with it because they're able to bring their sense of mission to the work that they do. So that's what creates employee engagement, those 4 conditions. And this is what I talk about in the book. And therefore, what tools do you use to measure these different conditions? And so I divide the book up into 3 parts, looking at these different conditions. So values alignment and mission alignment, we measure that through the cultural values assessment that we do, and this is what engaged employees are experiencing. They want to experience values alignment. In other words, the number of matching personal and current values wants to be as high as possible, and the number of matching current and desired values wants to be as high as possible. That's the mission alignment piece. We feel that the organization is on the right track. And at the same time, what leaders must do to create engagement themselves personally is to walk the talk, in other words, to operate from full spectrum consciousness to the extent that they can, and we measure that through the leadership values assessment or the leadership development report. And then we also have the structural alignment piece, which is making sure that the collective values of and beliefs of the organization support or are at the same level as to support the psychological development of employees. And in that regard, I devote another whole chapter in this book to looking at the values that are at the heart of democracy, because one of the things I'm saying here is that in order to engage your employees fully, the basic is that you have to live what we call democratic values. It doesn't have to be a democracy, but you have to live democratic values. In other words, there has to be a certain level of autonomy for people to be able to engage in their work. They have to be a sense of equality. In other words, low levels of hierarchy or no hierarchy whatsoever. So you've got autonomy, you've got equality, accountability, fairness, openness, transparency, and trust. These are the 7 values that link to democracy. And I talk about them in Love, Fear, and the Destiny of Nations, how each one of those values links progressively to the next. And I've also discussed that in this book too. I take these 7 values and I show them how each one leads to the next and how important that is to an organization in the way that it is aligned structurally. So how do you create a culture of engagement? Well, many of you who've heard me speak before, I talk about the 3 mantras of culture change. Cultural organization, the culture of an organization is a reflection of leadership consciousness. In other words, the stage of psychological development the leaders have reached. Organizational transformation begins with the personal transformation of leaders. In other words, organizations don't transform, people do, and particularly the leaders, because they influence the culture. And so as leaders shift their level to higher levels of psychological development, particularly in the growth needs area, the culture will change. And of course, measurement matters, and that's what we do. We measure cultures and we map the values of leaders. So how do you create a, I've already shown you this one. Whoops, I'm going backwards, sorry. Hit the wrong button. Okay, so here you see on the left, cultural values assessment. This is the current culture of the organization with a low level of cultural entropy. I'll tell you what that entropy is in a moment. And on the right, we have a leadership values feedback. In other words, these are the top values that the people who work for a leader see in the leader, whereas on the left, you've got the top values that people in the organization see in the culture. And cultural entropy is the degree of dysfunction in the system. And the degree of dysfunction in the system, 7%, is very low. But what causes the degree of dysfunction in the system, in other words, the cultural entropy, is the personal entropy of the leaders. I'll say more about that. But what you see in both of these cases is that what you're getting is a high number of top 10 values at that level of internal cohesion. That's the level of trust. And by the way, tomorrow I'll be speaking at the Trust Conference in London. If any of you are attending, give me a shout, and maybe we'll have time for coffee or something. Anyhow, this is one of the slides I'll be showing tomorrow. Now, Hannah did some research for us where she looked at 100 leaders who've done 360-degree leadership values assessment feedback using our tools between 2008 and 2010. And we looked at the leaders with low personal entropy and on the left, and these are the values that showed up in the low-level entropy leaders, and in other words, the best leaders: commitment, positive attitude, accessible teamwork, etc., etc. And the values with the asterisk are level 5 internal cohesion values. Now we look at the high entropy leaders on the right-hand side, and the only value, well, there are two, actually only one value that is shared between these is commitment. They're committed, but they're controlling, they're ambitious, they're focused on results, they're demanding, etc., etc. And you see all those limiting values showing up. And so that's what the best leaders tend to focus on. So the leaders with the low levels of entropy, personal entropy, create cultures with low levels of cultural entropy. So many of you are listening in and are familiar with the 7 levels of model based on Maslow's hierarchy, but extended. And I extended it by looking more deeply into self-actualization. In other words, expanding self-actualization into multiple levels, substituting states of consciousness for hierarchy of needs, and each state of consciousness is defined by specific values and behaviors. What I'm now doing in this new book is I'm relating this 7 levels model to the stages of psychological development. So once you've reached a young adult, you pass through the first 3 stages of psychological development, but you can still be operating with level 1 consciousness even though you pass through that stage of psychological development. So how well we master the first 3 stages of psychological development determines what levels of consciousness we're going to be operating on when we become adults. So again, many of you have seen this. It's been in all my books. I won't spend too much time on it, but at the level of personal consciousness, level 1 is about financial security and safety, level 2 about belonging, level 3 about self-worth. When you become too focused at these levels because of anxieties, at level 3 you move into power and status, you look into being liked and blamed at level 2, you focus on control and greed at level 1. As you move to level 4, you begin to understand your deeper motivations. You begin to want to experience autonomy, in other words, responsible freedom, and be accountable for your life. And you begin to recognize that some of the fear-based beliefs that keep you locked into these first 3 levels of consciousness are not helping you, and so you begin your work on personal mastery. At the same time, you begin to move towards finding your soul purpose, finding your deeper sense of meaning. At level 5, collaborating with others so you can actualize your meaning in the world and with more leverage. And level 7, service to humanity and the planet. And we see the same thing in organizations: financial stability, belonging, and high performance. These are the first 3 levels of consciousness. When there's a lot of control, corruption, and greed, these are limiting values showing up at level 1. Manipulation and blame are limiting values that show up at level 2, and bureaucracy, complacency, arrogance are values that show up at level 3. When you move to level 4, you get into continuous renewal and learning, and when you see in the current culture many of these limiting values, in the desired culture you see a lot of values showing up at level 4, the transformation level. At level 5, we build that internal cohesion, which is based on trust and shared values, openness and transparency. We begin to want to develop strategic alliances in order to make a bigger difference in the world and expand our influence. And at level 7, we begin to focus on conscious capitalism, if you like, maybe even at level 6 too. Because at level 6 we have environmental awareness, but we began to realize that the organization actually is embedded in society, and if the organization is going to be successful, society has to be successful too, and so the organization becomes a servant of society. Not too many leaders really get that point, mostly focused in the lower levels of consciousness. So we map values by asking people to pick values that represent who they are, values that represent their organization, and values that represent how they like their organization to work, and we plot these results. So I'm going to, many of you are familiar with that, but I just say one more word. So we plot the top 10 values that are in the current culture. These are the values that people picked, and everybody picks 10 values from a customized list, and these are the top 10 in this particular case with 100 employees, and they all belong to a particular level of consciousness. And then, but because we had 100 employees and they all picked 10 votes, that's 1,000 votes, we can actually plot the distribution of consciousness, and we can actually calculate the level of cultural entropy. These are the values which are limiting, which showed up before, like control, image, tradition. These values contribute towards the cultural entropy. They only occur at the first 3 levels of consciousness, and we see the calculation here. Anything below 10% entropy is great, and as you move progressively up to 20%, 30%, and 40%, you have more and more issues regarding leaders. When you get above 40 to 50% cultural entropy, there's so much energy going into these potentially limiting values and so little energy going into values added work that these companies tend to go bankrupt or be taken over by others, have poor financial performance. So what is cultural entropy? It's the amount of energy in an organizational culture that is consumed in doing unproductive work. It's a measure of the conflict, friction, and frustration that people find in the organization. And cultural entropy, and this is important, is a function of the personal entropy of the current leaders of the organization and the institutional legacy of past leaders as embedded in the structure, systems, policies, and procedures. And that's why it's important to have structural alignment, because you can go in and help leaders change, but unless you change structure, systems, and policies and procedures, you've still got the legacy of the personal entropy of the past leaders locked into the organization. Several years ago now, we did this research work with Hewitt, where we plotted employee engagement against cultural entropies for 163 firms in Australia and New Zealand region. We found this amazing relationship. In other words, high engagement comes with low entropy, low engagement is high entropy. And we found that entropy at less than 10%, that's good, gave you 3-year revenue growth at something like 33%, whereas entropy above 29% gave you only 3-year revenue growth of 11%. In other words, these people with high entropy have low engagement, and the low engagement translates directly into poor performance. These are the different levels of cultural entropy, and so here's an example of a leader with a company, on the left, with high levels of cultural entropy, 38%. But when you look at the LDA feedback from 14 assessors of the actual leader, all you see are pretty much, except for one value, is limiting values. This leader is experienced, but he's also into power, blame, demanding, manipulative. So here you see the relationship between personal entropy creates cultural entropy.
And Richard, that's kind of related to a question that we have from our audience. If you don't mind, can I ask that question?
No, that's perfect. I love the way you just jumped in there, Hannah. That's perfect.
Okay. The question is, How can you help shift the psychological level of the leader of an or leadership team? Typically we find that CEOs and promoters often get caught up in the short term. Yeah. Is there an elegant way to show them the light without being labeled as a preacher?
Yeah, wow, that question really plays into what we do. Is there an elegant way to show them the light? Man, there is. It's called the cultural values assessment and the leadership values assessment. In other words, you don't come in as consultants and tell people like, yeah, you're doing this wrong and this isn't working. You get the people to pick the values, their personal values, the values they see in the organization, the values they like to see in the organization, and you do that at different levels in the organization so you can pull out the results for the whole leadership team. And so you see the leadership team, you see their personal values, you see the values they see in the organization and the values they'd like to see. And 9 out of 10 times, it's not always the case, but very often, the culture, the current culture, the values there's limiting values there. They're in the first 3 or 4 levels of consciousness. And you look at the desired culture, and it's transformation level and higher. And when you feed that back, you're not telling people, okay, I've done my research and this is what's wrong. What you're showing them is their own interpretation of what's going on, and it creates something called cognitive dissonance. In other words, they can't continue living the way they're living, knowing that they've created this current culture with these limiting values where they actually want, when you look at the desired culture, what they want is something different. That's what I do when I feed back the results. I go, okay, so, here's the current culture, and here's the desired culture, and there are your personal values. Your personal values look a lot like the same levels as the desired culture, but the current culture is way down here. So why did you create that? That creates cultural dissonance. It creates in people's minds the fact that they think they're living one way, but they're actually living another way. And then one of the things you can do is bring in the trust matrix. Again, it's an exercise I've written up in the new book, and I'm going to be talking about that tomorrow at the trust conference, where there are 12 values that build to trust, and you just break people into pairs and say, okay, here's 5 red dots and 5 green dots. Stick these 5 red dots on these 12 values which were poor performing, and 5 green dots on the ones where we're good at, and you get a map of what's working and not working in the leadership team in terms of trust, which is absolutely essential for internal cohesion. Again, that creates cognitive dissonance. And so this idea that we are wanting one thing but are creating another, that gets people into a place where they can't live with that, and therefore they have to do something about it. And slightly long answer, but great question, and gets right to the heart of what we do with the cultural transformation tools. Same applies with the leadership development report, the leadership values assessment. The leader picks 10 values about how they're operating, and they think they're operating, and they get the feedback from the 14, 15, or 20 people that they asked to give feedback, and they see that the levels of consciousness that are operating are, as seen by their employees, could be quite different from what they think. And again, that can create cognitive dissonance. Sometimes employees see the leader performing on higher levels of consciousness than the leader does, and that's in this way is good news, is the leader's not really stepping up and owning the fact that they are, they're really quite confident and highly evolved individuals. Okay, Hannah?
That sounds good. We have about 6 minutes left.
Oh my goodness gracious me. Okay. All right. Well, look, I'll keep plodding on, and we'll get there in time. We'll get there I'll do it in 6 minutes. Okay. All right. So I talked about personal entropy, and the personal entropy comes from the first three levels of consciousness. Level 1, it's about limiting beliefs that the individual holds about not having enough. Level 2, about limiting beliefs that holds about not belonging. And level 3, limiting beliefs about not being enough. Now, the interesting thing is, and this goes back to the stages of psychological development, when you were going through that first 20 years of your life, the feedback you got from your parents and your culture conditioned these limiting beliefs, particularly up to the age of 7 or 8, when your brain wasn't fully functioning. What do I mean by that? Well, in order to get through the birth passage, our heads are not fully developed, so our limbic brain and our reptilian brain are fully operating. That deal with survival and emotional, but our neocortex, and particularly the frontal part of the neocortex, is not well developed, and so our reasoning powers are not all there. So we interpret the world during those first few years of our life through our emotional experiences, and these become, and since our mind, our brain is fresh and new, what we learn in those first few years of our lives become deep tracks in a record, and these become the limiting beliefs. If we grow up with self-actualized parents who know how to treat children very well, we won't have so many limiting beliefs. But if we grow up in a dysfunctional family, we'll finish up with a lot of limiting beliefs which come back and haunt us for the rest of our lives. I say jokingly, but it's true, everybody grows up in a dysfunctional family. It's just that some are more dysfunctional than others, and even if you have a family, it will be to some extent dysfunctional, but it'll be less dysfunctional if you've reached the highest stage of psychological development when you have your children. Okay, I just want to now show you, we know how to map our values, and I just want to show you now the example, we're going to finish, of NedBank, and some of you may have seen this before, but I wanted to show some slightly different data that I normally see. We started working with NedBank in 2005 when it was pretty much recognized in South Africa as a basket case. It was taken over by Tom Boardman. Entropy was at 25%. Here is the current culture over the period and what happened. McKinsey recommended to Tom that he use our tools, and each year they used the tools. They figured out what were the 3 things they were going to do during the next year to reduce the entropy and improve the consciousness. And here you see the result from 2005 to 2008, and 2009 to 2011. I've also got results for 2012 and 2013. But what you see is the entropy reduced from 25% to 11%. It's now at 10%. You can't do much better than that. So here you are in 2011. This is what the top 10 personal values, the top 10 current cultural values, and the top 10 desired cultural values. And you see the number 1 value in every case is accountability. That is brilliant. That is these people are really accountable for the work that they do. And in the current culture in the middle, you see the client-driven, client satisfaction, etc., etc. So 11% entropy. So here's what happened was the survey is open, but you don't have to take the survey. But what people began to realize very quickly is that the leadership was listening to the results of this survey and doing something about it. And so the level of participation increased year by year, and it's now leveling off around 75%. Whereas as participation increased, cultural entropy, as they worked on it, went down. And the mission alignment, that's the number of matching current and desired cultural values, went up and up, dropped down a bit in 2012. But the number of matching current and personal values and current values went up. So that's what happened to mission alignment and values alignment. And this is what happened to total revenue. The red line is cultural entropy. The blue line is total revenue. In the middle there, you've got the global economic meltdown in 2008. NedBank recovered very, very quickly and continued to grow. Now, this is the evolution of productivity. So this is revenue per capita. So as cultural entropy dropped, revenue per capita increased. In other words, people were more productive. And this is what happened to share price. A little more volatile, but what happened was that the share price recovered very much more quickly than it did in other non-values-driven organizations. So that's the end of the presentation. I said I would do it in 6 minutes. I didn't believe I would, but I did. And we've got time for one or two last questions.
Great. We actually are at the hour, but why don't you and I say we'll stay 5 minutes later and answer a couple of questions, and if people need to drop off, we really appreciate you coming. And
we do really appreciate that. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, so
well, if people hadn't shown up, I'd have been talking to you, Hannah, and not with we often have these conversations.
We do. Okay, so let me ask a question. Let's see. Okay. This is an interesting question. I'm interested to hear how you respond to this. I think I might know, but I'm kind of interested how you're going to say.
Oh, boy.
The two most important influences of your life are love and fear. Both cannot be measured. How can you reconcile this with the need to always be measured?
Woohoo! All right. Okay. Love and fear. Okay. All right. I talk about this quite a lot in What My Soul Told Me. What we attempt to do in the cultural values assessment is use potentially limiting values as a proxy for fear, because potentially limiting values are fear-based. For example, a lot of bureaucracy is based on the fear that you can't trust people. Short-term focus is based on the fear that if we don't get results now, I'm going to get fired as a CEO. Blame is based on the fear that if people find out that I did this thing, I'm not going to be liked anymore. So potentially limiting values are all linked to levels of fear. And the highest levels of fear that we have are at the survival level. The next level of fear is at the relationship level. The next level of fear is the self-esteem level. So when I look at the results of the survey and I see, I look at levels 1, 2, 3, how much entropy showing up at each level. And I know that when I see entropy showing up at level 3, whether it's for a leadership assessment or for a cultural assessment, I can fix that. I can help the organization fix that quite quickly because the level 3 fears are not as deep as the level 1 fears. So I call that broken bones. We can fix broken bones like you can in the hospital. You go in, you get the thing reset, and you're up and running. Level 2 fears have to do with relationships, and they're not so easy to fix. In a way, it's a little bit like cancer. Cancer is kind of like a relationship thing that's going on at the cellular level, where cells stop cooperating and one cell will focus on its own self-interest and keep on growing and growing. So at that level, this is a little more difficult to fix because you're dealing with relationship predispositions which create dysfunction. And in some ways, the hardest things to fix are the deepest levels of fear, which occur at the level 1, which are, I call existential angst. In other words, you're so wrapped up in the fact of surviving and with limiting beliefs about surviving that you find it really difficult to get past those. So I relate both at the personal level in the leadership assessment and at the cultural level. I link this, I link fear to limiting values. In Love, Fear, and the Destiny of Nations, I went even further, and I said, well, look, at one end of the spectrum is fear, in the middle of the spectrum is trust, and at the other end of the spectrum is love. And you can't get into love unless you trust. And I also measured using some results from another type of survey, the level of fear in nations. And I showed that the level of fear, cultural fear in a nation, is directly and inversely linked to the level of democracy. And I found also, even in the most top 20 highest democracies as measured in the Economic Intelligence Unit, I found a straight line relationship between the level of fear in a nation and the level of democracy. And so as you improve the level of democracy, the level of fear went down. I mean, it makes a lot of sense. But the question was, how do you, can you measure it? Well, you can't measure it directly, but you can measure a proxy. And we call that cultural entropy and personal entropy. Anything else, Hannah?
Yep, we have one more question. This is about personal evolution. And so what about the cases of stunted development? Say someone who has experienced a lot of trauma or an abusive environment when growing up and finds himself in middle age with a yearning for self-actualization but keeps stumbling because of the lower stages are only partially developed. How would one go about filling in the gaps retrospectively and stabilize the individual's foundation for self-actualization?
So it's an interesting question. I've been reading about that quite a lot lately, and that level of dysfunction or hurt really requires some form of psychotherapeutic input. But what the recent work on neurobiology is teaching us is that what has happened is that the limiting beliefs have formed in that person's mind at an early age and have created neural pathways that kick into action the moment that they see something that looks like something they experienced in the past. And interestingly, the mind is programmed to focus on threats and fear before it focuses on anything else, and that's essential for survival. But unfortunately, when you've had that abusive childhood, you're constantly being taken back to those thoughts. Now, all the reading I've done on neuroscience suggests that these situations can be healed or reversed, if you like, by creating new neural pathways. So it's not by focusing on the issue, it's by focusing on a way of being that is positive and enables one to get past those limiting beliefs that have been so disruptive in your life. And I mean, we all have them to more lesser or greater extent. And I was just reading a book on the holiday. David Rock, I think, is a really good author in this area. And I read one bit, which I've actually, applied to myself in the last couple of weeks since I've read it, is that whenever you have one of the, you're triggered and one of those emotional reactions pop up, like a mild reaction like, oh, fuck it, or oh, damn it, that person really, is irritating me, or whatever. It just simply suggests that you say to yourself, you become your own self-witness, and you say, veto that thought and replace it with a positive thought. Veto that thought and replace it with a positive thought. And that actually is what basically neuroscience is telling us in terms of healing trauma, that they can be healed, but you need to build new neural pathways in the brain to replace those which are so embedded. And so you don't work on the issue, you work on the solution to the issue, and hence build up new neural pathways. This is not the area of my expertise, but it is an area that I'm very interested in and do a lot of reading. So that's what I've learned in the last 2 or 3 months as I've been getting more and more into brain science.
Well, thank you, Richard. This has been really enjoyable for me. I hope it was enjoyable for everybody else. I appreciate everyone showing up and Richard taking the time to come and chat with us. We will be sending out the slides that Richard has used in his presentation, as well as access to the recording after the fact. So if there's anything you wanted to kind of catch up on or look back at, you will have access to that. And if you have any questions at all, feel free to contact me, Hannah@valuecenter.com, and I would be more than happy to answer them. So thank you, Richard.
Hannah, for hosting this so beautifully. I really enjoyed our interaction, and thanks for jumping in and asking the questions when you did. It was very appropriate.
Well, thank you very much, and have a great day, everyone.
Bye.